Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur, and in this week we have been talking about language. Now in the last lecture I was trying to explain what is language, and I was trying to talk about what is it so unique about human languages that sets it apart from other species, that sets the human language apart from the other communication systems that so many other species seem to use. In today's lecture, I will try and give you a brief historical background of where the study of language really comes from, because that is important in a way, because that will help you appreciate why is, or the kind of thought, the kind of things you will read in this current course, is that how have we come till here from the past. What were people thinking about language when it began, when the studies or interest in language came up, and what do people think now, and why do they think in that way. Also, one of my favorite topics under language is basically the evolution of language. Now it is something that is rather fascinating, and it is something that it does not seem to be solved at any point in time, but there are some very interesting theories about how has language evolved. Who was the first person that started to speak, what was his language like for that matter, and how do languages change over time. So we will do two things in this lecture. We will talk about some historical background into psychology of language, or the study of language, and we will try and talk a little bit about the evolution of language. So without wasting any time, let us move to the historical background now. So what is the historical background? So one of the earliest studies in psycholinguistics, one of the earliest work in psycholinguistics have been attributed to this person called Wilhelm Wundt. Now if you have taken my earlier lecture, or if you have been students of psychology at any point in time, you would know that Wilhelm Wundt is is credited to be the person who has formed the first laboratories in psychology in Leipzig in Germany. Now Wilhelm Wundt was interested not only in other mental processes but also language, and one of the things Wilhelm Wundt says about language is that a word, but not the sentence, is supposed to be the primary unit of language production. So he says that a word is the primary unit of language production. People speak in words and not really in sentences. That's something that Wilhelm Wundt said long back. Also, he seems to opine that production of speech refers to the transformation of thought into sequentially organized speech segments. So the idea is speech is nothing, speech is just a manifestation of your thought, and the idea is it is just transforming the thought into sequentially organized speech segments. So we will talk about this in a bit more detail, and once we go ahead you will see. After this, the early phase of language and stuff, one of the more interesting phases about language was the behaviorist phase in psychology. So because we are talking about psychology of language primarily, the interest in what language is as a mental function, or what does language mean for human behavior, came under interest from what are called the behavioral psychologists. And behavioral psychologists basically opined that language is a form of verbal behavior. Now what do we mean by verbal behavior? When I am saying verbal behavior from the behaviorist stance, it means that it is something that is learned through systematic deliverance of reinforcements or punishments at an appropriate time, and basically is learned through what is called the language environment. So the idea is that any language that you speak or I speak is basically learned by us over time, and it is basically learned as the function of whatever reinforcements we have got, whatever rewards we have got, or whatever punishments we have got. So whatever we have learned, it's probable that somebody reinforced us to learn that, and whatever we have not really learned in the language, it's probable that somebody has punished us for not learning that. So that is again the behaviorist stance of psychology. I've talked a lot about this in the earlier course, but just to give you a brief, behaviorists used to think that all behavior is an aspect of learning. I will talk about behaviorism and nativism in some of the next lectures of this course as well, but the idea is that they believed that any behavior, that human beings are born as blank slates, and any behavior is learned through reinforcements and punishments. Things that we are rewarded for, we pick them up, things that we are punished for, we kind of throw them away. So, that is again one of the things that that is the view of language that was taken by behaviorists. Then comes the Chomskyan revolution. Why do I call it a revolution? Because Chomsky kind of triggered this long back in the 1950s when he wrote a review of B.F. Skinner's book. B.F. Skinner was one of the foremost behaviorists, and he wrote a book titled Verbal Behavior, and in this book B.F. Skinner kind of describes how language is learned through various regimes, reinforcement procedures, other kind of procedures. How is language picked up from the verbal behavior by children? Now, Chomsky writes a very scathing review of this book and kind of in some sense almost tears the arguments apart thread by thread. So, Chomsky kind of presents contrary views with really very forceful arguments and says that the arguments for learning of language or the behaviorist's account of language is inadequate, and he gives out various reasons. So, we will talk about those reasons in a bit, but this is what is referred to as the Chomskyan revolution by Neumeier in 1986, and he says that this is what ushers in a new era of understanding language. Let us talk about some of these examples. So, one of the accounts of behaviorists' account of language is something called the associative chain theory. Associative chain theory basically says a sentence consists of an association between individual words in a sentence. Say for example, if you have a sentence like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, all of these words are basically written in a particular way. If I write it differently, furious sleep ideas green colorless, it kind of means a completely opposite thing. We are not really changing the association between the words are just coming there in just a different order, but the idea is even though these two sentences are formed by these words which seem to be associated with each other, they do not really make any sense. It is something different. Suppose for example, let us take a different example, George picked the baby up or George picked up the baby. Again this just the form of the words is, or the way these words are changed, but the meaning is exactly similar. In the other one, even if you change the form of the words, the meaning was not changing. I mean, there is no meaning at all in the first set of sentences. This is again one of the examples that says that no, words cannot be just an associative chain of associative chain of words, and sentences cannot just be associative chain of words, because that does not really completely capture what sentences are. We will talk about that in much more detail ahead. One of the other arguments that Chomsky makes is referred to as the poverty of stimulus argument, and this argument was basically the fact that Chomsky was trying to say that there is simply not enough information in the linguistic environment to fully account for the richness and the complexity of the children's language. So, the idea is that the kind of language that children are capable of spontaneously producing by 3, 4, 5 years of age, they are producing a lot of language that they have not even heard of. They are producing a lot of spontaneous language that they are creating themselves, and they have not really been encouraged to do that or discouraged to do that in any which way. So, the idea is, if you look at the kind of language that the children are producing and if you look at the linguistic environment that the children have had, there is no one-to-one correspondence between these two things. Obviously, children do pick up some of the things from the environment, but the entire language output cannot really be explained by the language environment that the child is living in. So, that is one of the things. And an example of the fact is, say for example, the language that children speak is intricate and it is subtle, while the sample input might not be so subtle. So, sample input might be very complicated, sample input might be in some sense sometimes inconsistent as well. Suppose for example, if I am having these sentences, John believes he is incompetent or John believes him to be incompetent. The idea is, how is the child to make meaning out of this? Okay, it is just the same set of words, almost the same set of words, but they kind of mean very different things. There is just variation there. or let us say John wants him to win. Now there is no way the child can figure out what him means here, or John wants Bill to see, this is more specified in some sense. So one of the arguments that Chomsky was making is that if you try and explain whatever the source of child's language is, it is not certainly completely explained by the environment that the child is living. So that is the poverty of stimulus. There is less stimulus in the environment to explain the output of the child's language. So that is the second argument. Now in this sense, if you try and compare the behaviorist's account and you try and look at what Chomsky was trying to say, you will basically come to reason, or you will basically come to appreciate the fact that linguistic competency, or the entire knowledge of language that somebody has to be much more than just learned behavior. Our children do not really speak just what they have heard, or you don't really need to teach children word by word, sentence by sentence. They create a lot of language, and that competency is obviously certainly not just amounting to whatever the language environment had. It is much more than that. It is spontaneous, it is generative, it is creative, and it's all of those three things. So another aspect that I would like to say about is that language acquisition has to be more than the sum of reinforcements, punishments, or just associations. If you are just associating two words and they are coming together again and again, it does not really mean that they can be combined to create a lot of sense. You will create a lot of meaning, as we saw in the word that colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now all of this is perfectly legitimate, and these words are linked and associated in a particular way, but does not really have any meaning. So where does meaning come from? How do children start making meaning, and why do they only talk in meaningful ways? Those are the things which one needs to talk about. This is a little bit about the history or the historical arguments in psychology of language. Now just a little bit of a word about what contemporary psycholinguistics looks like. Contemporary psycholinguistics, other than having input from psychology and linguistics, is also interdisciplinary in the sense that it derives from computer science, it derives from artificial intelligence, it derives from philosophy, and also there are also a lot of neuroscientists who are working in their labs to understand how language is produced or comprehended. The kind of methods that these people are using are also varied. Say for example, they are using reaction time studies, they are using lesion studies when somebody's brain is damaged, and what kind of language input he can comprehend, or what kind of language output they can produce, those kind of things. And they have also things like neuroimaging studies, EEG, ERP, fMRI, and things like eye tracking studies. A lot of research in language or psychology of language is involved using eye tracking. Where are people looking when they are hearing something, or where are people looking when they are saying something? The focus is, however, on things like child language acquisition, syntax, how do people realize that this is a syntactically correct word, or how do people realize that this is a syntactically incorrect word, discourse level analysis, when are people able to read larger text, how are they making sense of it, and so on and so forth. So these are again some of the concerns, some of the things that contemporary psycholinguistics is looking for. Now also let me try and underline for you some of the interesting questions that are asked in contemporary psycholinguistics. There are about 10 important questions that contemporary psycholinguistics likes to talk about or seems to be working in, and I am just quickly running over this to give you a slight preview of what kind of things we might be talking about later. So what is innate about language? What are the aspects of language that children come with? Children are born with. Say for example, is it really, as behaviorists say, that children are born as tabula rasa, as a blank slate, and they don't know any language at all at their birth, and they pick up all the language from the environment? Is it like that? Also one of the questions that people are asking is, do processes of language operate independently or they interact? Suppose I am saying something, and at the same time I am understanding something that another speaker might be saying to me. Now are these two processes exactly same? Are they operating using the same mechanisms, or they are different? Suppose what I am trying to say here is, suppose language production and language comprehension are different processes, or you can say that language production and comprehension are basically forms of the same process. So, this is also one of the questions that people are asking. Also, people are asking about what are the language processes that are related to each other. Are reading and speaking related to each other? Are speaking and comprehending related to each other? Things like that. Also, one of the things that people are interested in from the linguistics perspective also is that how do different languages differ amongst themselves. So, if you are a linguist, basically you will be asking this question in terms of the form of languages, that what kind of grammar is there, what kind of words are used, what are the arrangements, say for example subject verb object or object verb subject, those kind of things. Or from a psychologist's perspective, you might be interested in asking that how are these languages understood differently? Does the brain need a different kind of an apparatus to understand English, or a different kind of an apparatus to understand Hindi, and so on and so forth. So, again these are some of the questions that people are asking. Also things like what are the processes involved in producing and understanding language? How do we speak? How do we comprehend? What are the areas of the brain? What are the component processes? We will talk about all of this in the coming lectures. Also, are the language processes specific to language, or they are related to general aspects of cognitive processing? If you remember, when we were talking about visual imagery, we were talking about this argument between Zenon Pilchin and Steve Koslin, and the idea was that whether imagery is language based or it is pure image based, or it's more like the world that it tries to depict. So, one of the things that you can derive out of it, and also is relevant to a psycholinguist or a psychology of language person, is the fact that does language actually partake in visual imagery, or for that matter if you go to the first chapter that we have done, does language partake in the conceptual semantic processes? Does language play a part in things like categorization in terms of concepts, or does language partake in building up scripts, say for example for going to a restaurant or going to a bar or going to a court hearing or so on and so forth. So, these are also very important questions that people are talking about. Another question that people are asking is what can we learn from the language of patients? Patients with brain damage. Suppose somebody suffered from a stroke, and the lesion or the damage in the brain is at a particular area in the brain, let us say Broca's area, or let us say Wernicke's area, and we will talk about those areas when we do a bit of cognitive neuroscience here as well. The idea is that the language output of these people also changes, the language output of these people also becomes slightly atypical. Can you, looking at from this on this atypical aspect of language, comment something about their behavior, comment something about the processes they are really using in making language, and how are these processes different from the language process of normal individuals? This is again a very important question. Also, how sensitive are the results of the experiments to the techniques employed? Suppose I am doing a single experiment, a word comprehension experiment, and suppose I am using eye tracking to look at this experiment, or reaction time studies to look at this experiment, or fMRI to look at these experiments. Will the results be consistent across all three techniques? What kind of techniques I should use to ask what kind of questions related to language? So, if you have or if you just want to pause and go back to the earlier course where I have talked about these different methodologies, you will understand that the kind of measures in these different methodologies are slightly different. But if we are talking about the same phenomena, shouldn't the results correlate with each other? That's one of the very interesting questions people are asking. Also, do we really need very specific rules for language processing? Do we really process language by strictly by grammar rules, or there are other things that help us process language? Also, what from all of this study of language that we have been talking about, or that we will talk about in the near future, how much of this can really be applied to everyday life? How much of this thing that you can apply to think like I have to go and talk to X person, communicate this message, I should use a structure like this. Okay. So, these are the things that we are interested in and people have been talking. Now, let me also talk about, before we move on to other more pointed aspects of language, one of the things I could talk about is the fact is this concept of modularity. Now, if you remember, again something I have talked about in the past is this concept of modularity given by Jerry Fodor. Now, Jerry Fodor was talking about modularity in the sense that each cognitive function is a unit of itself which does not really interact to other units. So, if I am talking about language as a cognitive function, knowledge as a cognitive function, decision making as a cognitive function, attention and perception as cognitive functions, then probably I will be talking about things like I might be talking about these 4 different things. One of them could be language, could be attention, perception, knowledge, decision making. So, we might be talking about the fact there is these 2 things, these 4 or 5 different cognitive functions are very different from each other and they are not really interacting, there are no connections between them. This is the concept of modularity. So, Jerry Fodor believes or proposes that language is a module, that is a self-contained set of processes. Herein you can have language comprehension, language production, language acquisition and semantics of language, those kind of things. But all of these processes may or may not be connected to each other, but the fact is none of this kind of interacts to the other processes that are in question. So, this is very interesting. This is one of the views that have been put forward and have been also contested vehemently. The contemporary psycholinguistics or psychology does not really buy this so much, but I will just kind of try and elaborate what their argument is. So, they would want that language be domain specific, all the processes just have to do with language, so will be together with language and will not interact with other things. Also that language is genetically determined, something there is an aspect of language that people have to be born with and will not be learned or cannot be learned for that matter. Also that there is a distinct neural structure in the brain that is dedicated to language acquisition, comprehension, production, etc. And these neural structures do not perform any other tasks, are not connected to any other cognitive functions for that matter. Also one of the things that are implicit in this assumption of modularity is that language needs to be computationally autonomous. So, the idea is if language were to be a completely modular function, it will have to be a standalone autonomous thing, as I was trying to say here. So, production processes, comprehension processes, etc. Do not need to interact with things like knowledge. Suppose you have to talk about an apple, this is not really linked here. But just to tell you that in the current or in the contemporary view of language as a cognitive function, we are kind of thinking of language as being linked to each of these things, and for the most part you can think that all of these arrows are bidirectional because there is a lot of exchange or interchange between both of these different kind of cognitive functions, between language and so many other cognitive functions. So, that is again one of the views that was there about language, but it is not really moved there. And this view which I have been talking about, that all of this language and other cognitive functions are linked, is basically referred to as the interactionist view. So, the interactionist view of language says that language and other cognitive processes might not only be interacting with each other, but they may even be overlapping as far as different component processes are concerned. So, let me give you an example. If you have to talk about your vacation, if you have to talk about the trees that you saw in your vacation, you have to use a lot of this knowledge, or you have to use a lot of the content from the system that contains your knowledge. You have to use a lot of content from how your concepts are organized, and that is what is being referred to in the interactionist view, that language is basically contained in so many of these different processes, that language interacts with so many of these different processes. Now, there are different ways in these interactions might happen. Things like, say for example, it could be a discrete model. There are these discrete modules that interact with each other. You can draw it slightly differently in a cascaded way. A cascaded way means that some activation is happening in the language module which will also activate some of the other modules, things like language or attention or perception. or there could be, you know, a non-interactive bottom up way, that something starts from perception, it goes to knowledge, then it comes to language, things like that. And again, these might not be, you know, these arrows, when you are talking about a bottom up, strictly bottom up kind of processing, might or might not have you know, bidirectional connections. One of the other views could be the top down processing view, or the you know, totally interactive processing view. Could be that the fact is that there are back and forth connections between the bottom up process. Suppose I have to describe a scene, I am looking at the perceptual inputs as well, and I am creating a particular, you know, description of that using my language. Also, I am at the same time borrowing from the top down centers, from the memory, from the knowledge centers, and kind of both of these processes are coming and meeting in somewhere in the middle, and that is what is leading to what my language is. So, this is slightly important, that one view of language was that language is modular, it is very domain specific, it is genetically determined, and it does not really interact with our processes. But the more prominent and the more logical probably way of seeing this is that certainly language interacts with so many of the other cognitive processes, and there are ways in this, in which these interactions are possible. Again, so this is pretty much what I wanted to talk about in terms of what language is, or what are the basic, you know, historical views of language. So, I will stop here, and in the next lecture I will talk a little bit about evolution of language.